interesting. I want to say it began with birth because of what I look like, and that always made me self-conscious about where I belonged and where I fit in my town. Um, I come from a very local family. My mom looks very, very local. Most of my family does, and my looks were always something to comment on. So there was always kind of a is she a tourist? What is she doing here? And so I got used to introducing myself and giving my context to everybody and feeling very self-conscious about all of that. And uh, my looks just kind of that evolved into a whole identity crisis. And then later, having I married into a very large, sprawling Native Hawaiian family, and I had always my understanding of what blood quantum was basically. I mean, I grew up in a time in Hilo that you didn't really have a lot of Hawaiian history being taught in public school. We spent one day on it. This is the day that Hawaii became a state, nothing else. And so what I understood of what being a native Hawaiian meant, what I understood was you check a box when they give you the paper at the beginning of school, and that means you have a chance to go to Kamehameha schools, which were superior at that time, probably still are, I'm not sure, of most of the public school options. And if you had enough Hawaiian, you could qualify for Hawaiian homelands. If you didn't have either one of those things, that was that was basically all I knew, because most of the community are so mixed, right? The Hawaiian Kingdom at a time was mixed because of the sugarcane era. It was very um, labor intensive, so people from around the world came to the kingdom to work in the sugarcane um, kind of world, and that's why I'm Filipino, Puerto Rican, Portuguese. All of these groups migrated to Hawaii to work in that time. So the kingdom itself was fairly cosmopolitan, and so you have a lot of mixes. And so I was more self-conscious about being white versus being Native Hawaiian and being not Native Hawaiian. And it was only with the evolution of like the kingdom talk in the 90s and in the 80s became something of a reason to go back and look at the definitions of who belongs and who gets to say. And so I kind of, because of my young upbringing, my young kind of questions about this anyway, I paid attention to it and took it very personally. Are they saying for me to go home? And if they're saying that, then where is home and who are they? A lot of those people were my cousins and my aunties and people I grew up with that were protesting certain things. And so marrying into fast forward a few years and marrying into this Hawaiian family and then having a daughter who's Native Hawaiian, I kind of it was a relief to me, in the sense of like she won't have those questions or that ambiguity that I did, right? It's a certain thing. She has this on her birth certificate. Not that she might want to take advantage of the resources available to her because of it, but simply she'll know who she is. She can say she's this and that, versus me, I come with a whole dissertation, and and then, fast forward a few more years, divorce, I remarried, I have another child, and she doesn't have Native Hawaiian. And because I was already sensitive to it, and I left the islands, I was frustrated with I with my role there culturally. I didn't know how to contribute to my home, and having my two daughters side by side, and sometimes having family call me and say, your eldest needs to come home, she needs to be with the Aina, she needs to do this and this. And I had such a visceral reaction to that of like, well, what about my other daughter? Don't treat them separately. Not that I want my other daughter to be treated as a Native Hawaiian, but does my other daughter have a connection and a responsibility to Hawaii? And it was basically my questioning all over again. So I think this book, while I never really wanted to write about all that terrified me and all my vulnerabilities, when I set out to write a book about my home, that to me was the truth of it. And it was a framework that I think exemplified how complicated and nuanced contemporary Hawaii is. So this is a very long answer to your question, but I think, all of my own personal feelings and relationship with having blood versus not having blood, I've lived it, my children have lived it, and so this was my way of trying to maybe explore that and voice the questions that maybe everyone will have a different answer to, but I certainly don't have the answer to.
Well, and obviously, this novel also has a lot to do with hula, or hula is both very important to the characters that you're working with here. It's also very important to the place and important to you personally. You danced hula as a young girl and up and I think through college, right? Didn't you pay your way through college, at
I
least partially, with like
I dance,
Tahitian hula dancing?
yes, those luau's. I'm in a lot of honeymoon pictures. Yeah.
I mean, I got to say, reading this novel made me think to myself, like, is it okay to like, I feel bad going to Hawaii and staying at a hotel. These people just resent you. They're just like, get out of here. And I think so many tourists, like their context for a hula dance is at a hotel with like
Yeah.
the tiki torches burning and the waves in the background and everyone feeling they're having a special moment. And I can't help but think like, wow, these luau dancers in their heads are probably like losers.
Well, I mean, and I think that's another aspect of why I wrote what I wrote and how that story came to be. When I first started dancing hula, I danced for a very traditional, very beloved halau that they're not performative at all, or they weren't at that time. Now they've evolved into, they do a lot of education, and they have a foundation, and it's a lot of cultural work and preservation. But at that time, I was taught in the way that they had been taught and their mothers had been taught, and all the way down the line of, we pass on these chants, we pass on these ways, we pass on these certain traditions, because that's the only way they're going to survive. And I really internalized that of here's how we're going to go, and we're going to gather this, and we're going to boil it down, and that's how we're going to dye this fabric. And then getting older and feeling self-conscious because I didn't, my Iolani, I'm named after a very very, very beloved icon of hula, Iolani Luahine. And I always felt kind of the weight of that, like, what is my kuleana? What is my responsibility to that name? And being not native, and not really having like a guidebook of where I belong, and who will give me the rules to follow. And then, getting older and then going into such a different field of a production company and dancing, not just Hawaiian but Tahitian, and all these different dances, and you're invisible. You're on a stage and everybody's clapping, and you're giving them what they are expecting, just something silly. And you see them coming up and standing in line and taking a picture with me. I mean, I booked jobs that were photo op, and I'm just standing there because they want to stand next to somebody in the costumes. And it was a different kind of invisible. So I think that was one of those internalized things of, we're here. And when I say we, I mean, when for me, the we of Hilo and of this book was, it was everybody in Hilo, as well as the Aina itself, as well as the gods and goddesses and our mythology and our belief system. It was all the ancestors, everybody that exists in this world that I come from. I used to, when my daughter was a baby, go down to the beach and sit there, and all of a sudden a tour bus would come, the beach would flood with tourists. there would be a smattering of pictures being taken, and they'd take pictures of me and my daughter, and without saying a word, and then 30 seconds later they're all gone. Nobody's touched the water, nobody said hello, and so there was just a, you're not seeing me, I'm just kind of part of the landscape. And that has been, there's so many instances of that, not just for me, just you know uh, the wider aspect of that. And so I didn't know really the context, I knew the feelings of the frustrations and everything like that. And it wasn't until I wrote this that I felt I needed to understand the history um, and all the ways blood quantum and the things that I've just kind of as a child just inherently pushed against because it was a sensitive issue, um, to understand it in a way that wasn't personal. This book kind of allowed me to explore that a bit.
And when you refer to blood quantum for people listening, can you just explain that a little bit more so people
Sure.
know?
Yeah, so blood quantum was an introduced concept by America when they took over the Hawaiian kingdom. To I mean, there were other aspects of blood quantum, but one of the best that I guess I can kind of point to was 1921, I believe, the Hawaiian Homestead Act, which was, America didn't want to be seen as a colonizer anymore. They were going to, quote unquote, give back some of the land that was stolen during the occupation of Hawaii, all the crown lands and all the land of the people, because they had a different land, land use and land ownership system, that they were going to, quote unquote, give it back because Hawaiians were dying off. I mean, exponentially. And everyone, just the consensus was, we need, Hawaiians need their land and the land needs Hawaiians, and so we're going to put Hawaiians back on the land. But the first thing they did was disqualify all the good, land that was good for agriculture, all the land that had water on it, all the land that could be developed for prominent housing, developments. And so you reduce all the land that you're going to say is for these Hawaiians, but you also don't want to give to everybody that says they're Hawaiian. So the creators of this act said, well, the Hawaiians, and it's very cringy to say this, but this was in the discussion of the development of the kind of the bylaws. It was basically, if a Hawaiian has enough white in them, if they've married an Englishman, or if they have children from missionaries and everything like that, they are well equipped with the blood to to do well. It's the Hawaiians that don't have that need help, because they don't have, I don't know what the implications were of having acumen or whatever it has. So they instituted a 50% blood quantum, which was basically saying you're at least half Hawaiian. And this is the definition of how we're defining a Hawaiian. America wrote that out and said, okay, well, and so now we're going to institute this. The saddest implication of that is that you have an end date where there will only, it immediately makes the population finite, and then it's just subtractive from there, right? A couple generations later, you're not going to have anybody that qualifies for that land. And I believe that was intentional, and especially with my research that has backed that up. And so it was a scary thing to write, but I do think it's a conversation that needs to be had. People need to know about these things because it's a ticking clock, you know.
Well, I got to say, Blood Quantum sounds sort of like a James Bond movie with Elizabeth
Very
Holmes
much
as the
so.
villain.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
and
very much so.
I think you write too that the way things are going with this policy in place, that because of uh, like what do you call it, like cultural intermarrying and all this, all that sort of thing, there will only be Native Hawaiians in the islands until 2044 or something, like you say, it's finite.
that
It,
they'll qualify in under the American definition of what a Hawaiian is. Yeah.
right,
You know,
right.
there's a projected date, which is horrifying because it's not that far from now.
I know. That's what I was thinking. I was like, oh, that's so sad. That's
Yeah.
so sad. But this book, it's very much about the question of what it means to be a Hawaiian and to have a claim on that place or really any place. I mean, that's what it evoked for me anyway. Like I think about this just as like an American mainlander. This is clearly not my land. We're sitting here on Tonga or Tongva land, right, in Los Angeles.
Hmm.
And you start to think like, where do I even belong? Like, I'm just like in the way.
Yeah, I mean,
Like,
and that for me, and I guess that's why it was so scary, but I didn't know how to write a love letter to my home without being completely like touching that, that exact soft spot of mine. And so for me, I couldn't explore what it is to be a Hawaiian, right? I could explore what it is to be a product of Hawaii's history and to have a family that has been so proud of its contributions to Hawaii and has called it home for since the 1800s. And I mean, my grandpa would always say we were Hawaiian at a time. It wasn't advantageous to put it on your birth certificate and yada, yada, yada. So we're Hawaiian. We just can't say we are. And, and so it always kind of, to me, it was more an exploration of what is home and what does that mean. I mean, if we're just talking about my personal how I kind of saw it, because I couldn't take the liberties to say what is it to be a Hawaiian. And that's why her blood breakdown is very ambiguous. And I mean, I think people will kind of have agreements or disagreements about exactly what she is and as far as blood goes. And that was on purpose. It was to say, well, where does she belong if she doesn't have that qualification on her birth certificate, if she doesn't meet America's definition of that? Is this home? Not that does this place belong to her, but does she belong to it? So it's a slight difference, but I guess to me I have to hold on to that one because it's still so real, for my family. That's what we grapple with every day.
and when you talk about Hi'i is the character at the heart of your novel.
Yes.
It's it's Hi'i and then her mother Laka, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
And Hi'i, I think, is in many ways kind of the you. I mean, the things that we've been discussing, because she's fair skinned, a redhead, green eyes, and the family is sort of like this isn't a this isn't a
Yeah.
Hawaiian child,
Very much
It's a
so. I mean, and I actually thought when I first started it that it was going to be one of those like auto fiction, and he turns out to be very much her own person. So while the origins of me wanting to write about a girl like he, I didn't really expect her to just kind of take life, and say, no, this is where I'm going with this. So she has a lot less in common with me than I had originally thought she would.
mm. And this book, I mean, this book really covers a lot of ground time wise. It spans generations. It goes deep into this family's history. And as an extension of that, it gets into Hawaiian history, Hawaiian cosmology. At the heart of it, again, is hula. And in a way that really touched me, like you have Hi'i, who I think has a deep sense of like the mystery of her existence, shall we say, and this feeling of maybe not quite fitting into the family into which she was born or into the place where she lives, and believing that if she can master hula as her mother Laka did in her youth as Miss Aloha Hula, right? Is that what it's called? Yeah.
Yes,
Her mother is like a hula champion, essentially,
basically.
if that's a way of putting it. And so he is trying to master hula, which again, with a kind of tourist understanding of hula, grueling to learn,
Yes.
physically demanding. The oh god, I'm gonna forget the word. What's the name of the teacher of hula? You're
The
at
kumu.
the kumu. You're at a halau
Yes.
with the kumu teaching you and it's sort of like boot camp. I mean, it's not
Oh,
this is not
and
like fun and
I mean,
games.
and culturally, I mean, if you come home and your mom says you got to do this weekend, you say no. Kumu said I got to do this. Your mom doesn't say anything. Teachers, same thing. In school, it's kind of just this unknown. Kumu has say. What Kumu says goes. If your
Wow.
Kumu is giving you orders, then everybody else will just kind of back off. So
Wow.
yeah.
And it's a sacred right to be taught hula in Hawaiian culture. Like, can any young woman try this, or do you have to be picked? Like,
Well, I think it really depends on the halau. I know that for most of the halaus that I know of, they do have an open enrollment. The priority is to teach this art and not just this art, but this way of life and this way of communicating with the land and being stewards of it, because so many of these lessons were embedded in these chants and these dances and this mo'olelo, these stories. And so I think usually you try it when you're young, or when you choose to do it older, as somebody who's older and coming to it as an adult or whatever, and you talk to your kumu. I mean, you talk to the head of that halau and you try it out, and there are many stages to becoming a master of it that um that I'm not. I'm and it can take your whole life to and be completely dedicated to hula to be able to be deigned a kumu, and that is a very big undertaking. And so I'm not sure exactly of how halaus have developed a protocol to kind of graduate a student to being a master, or a student to teacher. But I do know that it's a very big responsibility, and it's taken very, very seriously. And so when ironic, I mean, I didn't do any of the easy things, right? Just write about something vague. When I did this, I felt like hula was such a way that I have connected, and what was a way for me to explain or kind of give you a picture of the cultural responsibility and the cultural priority of keeping these things alive, versus the politics of self-determination and identity. But within hula, I'm not going to give you any of it, because I felt uncomfortable even pretending, to write some choreography or something like that. And so we had to find a way to navigate around the teaching you about hula, or giving you any assumption whatsoever that I was some kind of master, that I can illuminate certain things for you. All I could do was kind of emanate the feeling of what that is to be part of something bigger than yourself.
well, and it should be said too. I mean, it's obviously there's a ritualistic aspect to it, ceremonial, but and also, it's obviously movement, it's dance, it's also narrative. This is a storytelling medium, or like this is a
Yeah.
way for Hawaiians to pass down stories about who they are and what they believe, and stories about Hawaiian cosmology, right?
I mean, basically, I mean, think about Greeks and Romans. It was epic poetry. That's how you captured history. And then that's before we could write these things down. That's how they lived, was you tell the story. And so these stories and these hulas are very much that. That's why they talk about gods and goddesses and myths and legends, but they also talk about uh, volcanic events and the mist and how that came to be, and why this ocean does this, and what these fish do. It's knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, it really, I mean, I found it kind of poignant, like to be reading a novel about a culture that's kind of fighting to survive,
Yeah.
and to be reminded of the critical importance of narrative and storytelling to the survival of any people, any group of people or culture, if you can't tell these stories, if nobody knows these stories, then, and
Exactly.
if nobody knows this language, what
Well,
happens?
and I grew up, yeah, I mean, I grew up in such an interesting time. The 80s and 90s were no one. I had one cousin. When I say cousin, friend cousin, it's all the families that are, intermeshed and everything. There was only one that when he had to call home or something to his mom, he would speak Olelo, he would speak Hawaiian. Um, and everybody would kind of hush to just listen to him because no one spoke Hawaiian, not fluently. You had Pidgin, which is my, I guess, first language, and
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 what do you mean by pigeon? Just so people listening.
Pidgin, it's kind of the mixed plate, the linguistic mixed plate. It's the Portuguese and the Filipino and the Japanese and the Chinese and all of these. It's a Creole, it's a dialect. And every island has a slightly nuanced difference. So if you're local, you can kind of tell, oh, that guy's from Maui, that guy's from Honolulu. They're nuanced, but it very much is its own language. It has its own inflections and meanings, and so it was interesting to write it in Pidgin, and I did that very deliberately. Pidgin was something that you were very shamed if you spoke it to a certain extent. There's still a lot of discrimination. You're just assumed to be um, illiterate or not educated, unrefined. My mom was very shamed. Generations before her were very shamed for not speaking, English. And so my mom was very strict about no pigeon in the house, and I mean, it was a constant battle because she felt like it was going to be a handicap, a disadvantage. And there has been a renaissance that I've tried to highlight the coming of and the evolution of in hula, but going back to being olelo, that all started in the 80s and 70s, 80s and 90s. That cultural revolution and renaissance was very much tied to the language itself, because you had to have a group of people come together and say, we're going to create a curriculum, like on paper. It can't just be passed down through songs and hulas. We're going to create a curriculum on paper that actually teaches our youth the language. And Hilo was one of the first places that had a charter school that was only taught in Hawaiian, only Olalo. And it was a revolutionary thing, because you also had to think you had this very static language that had been kind of kept alive only underground, so to speak, and so it had to be artificially kind of fast forwarded, because there were no words for car and computer and internet and things like that, right? And so I can't imagine the undertaking that what but I was okay. I mean, it was just kind of happening in my backyard, and all of a sudden, I mean, and so actually one of those schools, it's in Keaukaha. And now when I fly back, like a trip or two ago, there were two airline stewards, and they were speaking to each other just very casually in Olelo, which it's amazing to me, the how quick, just a couple of generations now, all of my nieces and nephews, are so far ahead of anything that me or my cousins or my generation had access to and awareness of, because from language went, now it's cultural ways, and now they spend time a much more a part of their curriculum is being outside and being a part of Hawaii, not just as as like a homogenous people, but as almost subjects of the kingdom, multiple ethnicities coming together to just perpetuate the ways of this kingdom, or these people, this land.
Hmm. Well, one of the things that I couldn't help but notice about your book is its lack of a glossary, its lack of any footnotes, its lack of any hand holding when it comes to olalu and certain words in Hawaiian, pronunciations, any of that. As a reader, you are just immersed. And at first I remember I felt like a little bit destabilized. I was like, okay, where am I? What is this? And then it sort of teaches you. You have to sort of catch up. And that's what you're asking of the reader. You're not offering any of that stuff and kind of othering the Hawaiian culture and
And
the language.
yeah, and that was twofold. I mean, I grew up wishing I had a book that kind of echoed or reflected my world and the challenges of it and the navigating of certain things, but I didn't. Um, and and so part of that was of I didn't want any explanations other than what was absolutely necessary, because the more you explain, the less it becomes for a, a group or a place, instead of it becomes more of a, this is about Hilo, it's not for Hilo, and so you have a lot of narrated guides, to help you experience Hawaii in that way. And this, I wanted to present it to you. I mean, and it prompted many a discussion, it certainly did, on every level of the publishing process of this. But part of why we all stuck to what we did was I wanted to give you that sense of, and for you to never forget that you have arrived in a different country. And if it was a made up country, you would never forget it, but it is a place that you think, majority of people think they know what Hawaii is. And so this was a no, you're going to have to code switch here, and I'm going to take you to this different place. And you're not being given a guide, you're not being given a tour guide, you are being given the privilege of just kind of going into my living room and observing. And it's same like when I traveled or we lived abroad, we lived in Eastern Europe, and I would sit in a room and everybody would just be talking and just going about their day, and I knew nothing. I could pick up this word or that word, and all my other senses had to be tuned in. Body language, inflection, what was really kind of being communicated here. And that's what I tried to do a little bit of it by not giving you that glossary or othering the pigeon or explaining it within sentences and such.
So why were you in Eastern Europe?
Oh, that's another story. Yeah, my second husband, I guess identity and belonging has always been a thing, because my second husband was a survivor of the breakup of Yugoslavia. So he's half Muslim, half Serb, grew up in Yugoslavia, in Sarajevo. And so I was kind of driven to be there in Bosnia and in Serbia, and trying to unpack the issue of identity and blood, from a totally different, but also very weirdly parallel kind of situation.
This is a theme in your life, it seems like.
It, it is definitely my theme. Yep.
Okay. Well, another thing that I noticed and really admired about your novel is how it works structurally. You did not give yourself an easy task here. I think anytime you're working intergenerationally, anytime you're incorporating elements of history and cosmology, as we've discussed, anytime you're dealing with a large cast of characters, you run the risk of losing the reader or things becoming convoluted or hard to follow. And yet I never felt like that reading this book. It's it's built well. I have to
Thank you.
imagine that took a lot of labor. Like that
Thank you.
was
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. When the very, very first draft, it was very simple. Yeah, at least for me, it was very messy, but it was simply a story of this family, and they were having these conversations about, internally, that what was going to happen from generation to generation, and what was going to be passed down and what couldn't be. But people didn't understand it. I mean, the mainstream reader, same like me, isn't taught Hawaiian history, not in depth. And so I found myself kind of almost working my way out, where it was like, oh, I have to actually give you context for what they're fighting about, and what the stakes are within this family. I can't assume that that. This is not common enough knowledge. Like if I was doing it in some other place where we were very familiar with the occupation of it, or the genocide of this or that, or some other kind of injustice of history, I wouldn't I could write just within there, and I wouldn't have to explain to you the anger or the sadness or the frustration or any of those things. And so I very much had to understand it for myself to make sure I was getting it right, but then found myself saying, well, it adds so much more if you see the generational patterns, if you see how the thoughts have evolved and the opinions and the awareness of certain things and the priorities have changed over the generations and the decades in recent Hawaiian history. And so I think if I had tried to embark on this novel with how it is now, I would have completely felt intimidated and not able to do it. But in order to really make sure I was doing justice to each of the Naupaka women, I had to know and understand where they were coming from. And then I just felt like, well, then my reader needs to know that too, as much as I didn't want to write a missioner type, just a bunch of history in it. I just felt like it was integral to the story.
And the Napaka is the family name of
Yes.
Laka and Hi'i and what's
And
the mother's
Hulali.
name? Ulali,
Hulali.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
Well,
try
and
to
the
keep track
naupaka,
of everybody.
yeah, naupaka is actually a flower, and there's two naupaka plants. One is a mountain naupaka, and one is a beach naupaka, and so they each look like half of a flower. And so if you bring the two together, they create like an entire blossom. And there's a whole mythology and a story of why, and star-crossed lovers and everything like that, about why we have these naupaka. But I had given them this name before I made that connection of just kind of this unrequited disconnect, you know. And then, of course, as these things happen, I'm sure, a lot of writers can say the weirdness of when you're writing something and everything is right in front of your eyes. I'm writing this in my childhood room because I was going back and forth to Hawaii a lot to make sure I had all the things. And I've had a woodblock painting, printing since high school that my mom gave me, that I've kind of, tugged along everywhere with me. And on the bottom, it said, I forget her first name, but she's a Naupaka. I think it's actually Laka Naupaka. I may be mistaken, but it was just okay, how are the Naupakas with me now? It was quite a moment of realization.
Yeah, I feel like that. Yeah, I hear stories like that from people I talk with on this show. I've had experiences like this as a writer it's just like moments of synchronicity.
Yeah.
And that kind of gives you the chills. These two half flowers, and that fits beautifully into what you're telling here, right? I mean,
Thank you.
it
Yeah.
almost couldn't be better. And this is very much a story about generations. I think it's especially a story about generations of women and the difficult relationships between mothers and daughters, but also the loving relationships. How, like, the love is there, however much it may be
It's fierce. Yeah.
strained. Yeah, yeah. And there's a lot of wisdom, and I love, these characters in this book are tough stuff and strong-willed and have a lot of grit. And I'm thinking of the work that Ulali and Laka do, trying to protect, generations of their family, their land, Hawaii in general. Um, these are not shrinking violets, to make another flower
No,
reference.
yeah, and Hulali's generation is, it was my grandparents' generation, and that generation, they didn't talk much. They didn't tell you stories or give you a lot of hugs and honies and stuff, and it was just, you do this and don't ask why, don't ask questions, and so even writing her as this mix of all these memories and these people that I knew, or cultural figureheads, or public people, it was just, I was scared to write her. And so my editors would go back and they're like, can we have a little bit more Hulali? And I'm like, but she might not want me to do that.
Yeah.
Like because it is very real. Even, some of the research entailed me going back and saying, okay, mom, what did you prefer to, hit me with? Was it the broom or the stick? And she, oh, no, 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 the broom's too much, and a brush would break, but you do the, I mean, it was almost kind of funny to see how much things can change over not very long of a period of time.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was just thinking about this like a couple of days ago. But I grew up in a time when spanking kids still happened. Not much, but I think it was dwindling even when I was a child, but it was still there. In my junior high school, there was corporal punishment. I mean, it didn't happen very often, but like the principal had a wooden paddle and like would, theoretically be able to paddle kids who were misbehaving. And now I reflect on my time as a parent. I have 2 kids, and I got to say, like they misbehave like any kids and you have to correct them sometimes, but I've never once felt like, wow, I really could use a paddle or
Well,
it's totally
yeah,
unnecessary,
it is
to hit a
funny
child.
to see how much, like, even writing it, some of the editors go, "Oh my gosh!" And I had so normalized, and it wasn't necessarily abuse; it was just part of, like, the kids would be we'd be dropped off at school, and then the parents would call from the car to the teacher, "Hey, they're acting up. Give them a slap."
Yeah.
You have my permission. It was it I'm not minimizing it, but it didn't feel like a big thing growing up in it, and so my children, they're just like, wow, island mom, because to them I'm much harsher than their LA friend mothers and stuff, because I'll be like, what, it's right down the road, you walk, and so they're like, island moms, they're so much harder than, they're not the helicopter parent, or they are, but in a very different way, you know
Well, I was
so.
thinking, it made me think reading about Ulali. I was like, man, maybe I'm being too gentle. Like I hug my kids every day. I'm like, I love you. I'm proud of you. That's all I ever say to them. I'm like, maybe I'm ruining them. Maybe I need to
Making
toughen
them
up.
weak, yeah.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and that was very much a sentiment, my mom, I mean, it was like, you got to build your calluses, the world is tough, and honestly, I don't know how much of that was because my family is still primarily dominated by women, and there aren't a lot of sons born into it, and men around, but yeah, it was very much, it's still to a certain extent of like, you don't coddle your children, you're not doing them any favors.
All right. I got to toughen up.
It's
Got to.
tough, yeah.
My kids have no idea what's about to hit them and
Survival of the
I don't
fittest,
mean that
yeah.
literally. So
Yeah.
I want to talk about the path to publication, because along with the actual writing of the book, it was arduous to get this thing into print and into this lovely hardcover. We should say it's a beautiful
Thank
book.
you. Thank
Yeah,
you very
they did
much.
a nice
Thank
job
you.
on the design, and I want to just hear you kind of tell the story, the saga of
The
the
saga
book
behind
selling.
the saga.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's useful. People out there, they only see the book on the shelves in the bookstore. They often don't realize what it took to get it there. And what happened to you and to this book along the way is more common than maybe we like to think, or maybe more common than it should be. But it sold, and then it was, I think they call it orphaned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
just give people kind of an overview of that part of it.
And I guess that was the only reason I really even wanted to acknowledge that that was part of the story, was because there has been a call for diversity in books and voices and authors, um, and this journey kind of exemplified the challenges of what exactly that entails of change, right? It's not just about getting diverse authors, it's about how it's edited and how it's received in a house and how it's prioritized and all of these things. So yes, thankfully I had an agent from day one who loved it, believed in me, saw the vision of it, and she was so excited about finding it that in the process, while we were getting it ready to submit out, which we were editing it and polishing it up, she was talking to all the people she knows, of like, this, I can't wait, you're going to be so thrilled. So she had built up such an organic excitement for it that by the time we took it out, there was enough interest in it to garner an auction. And when speaking to a variety of different editors, they would ask me kind of what my priority was, and I said, well, my biggest priority was it was to assign value to my small little town that is so overlooked even within Hawaii. When I say where I'm from, they're like, Honolulu. And I said, no, not Honolulu. And they go, oh, Oahu. And I go, no, still no, you know?
Yeah.
And
And let me, I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt, but I
that's
think for
okay.
people listening, you're from Hilo. Hilo is on the Big Island
It is
of
on the Big
Hawaii,
Island. So when people say, well, what island is that? It does get confusing because it's Hawaii Island
right?
of the Hawaiian Islands. And I'll say the big one. And they say, oh, Oahu, because Oahu has the capital. But Oahu is actually very, very small, geographically. And so I wanted to my priority was treat this like a mainstream book, treat this with value, and so the editor who acquired it, very, very excited, and I was blown away by their plans for it and everything. And a few months later, she left, and it was, I guess, discussed in house of the reassigning when a book is orphaned. I think the process of assigning it to a different editor varies among imprints and publishing houses, but I believe there was a discussion, and it was assigned to an editor, and that's hard to begin with because when you are in the process of getting a book acquired, you and your editor, it's same like you and your agent when you meet. They're not just agreeing to represent you. They're agreeing we have a common goal here. We have a common vision for this, and we're working towards that same thing. And when it's orphaned, I think you lose that, right? I didn't have that talk with this editor to say, what do you think the vision of this is going to be? And I mean, we ended up having a conversation, but not in the before it's acquired kind of early stage. And she inherited this, so I can only imagine how challenging that was. But she didn't know all the cultural context of me and everything this book represented to me and to where I'm from. And and then it passed through a few more hands, because there were so many varying kind of ideas of where this book could go or should go. And ultimately, it wasn't, we never found that right place of coexistence, of being happy with the end goal. And thankfully we still had, I mean, years passed, of this very agonizing back and forth, especially during COVID, where you're feeling isolated already. And so you can't have these face-to-face conversations. You're doing it very awkwardly over Zoom or phone calls, and you're worried about the end of the world. And so when we finally moved, it was to an editor who loved it from day one. She was one of the original editors that had been interested in it. And we really kind of had to lay it all out of where we're going to go with this, and be very intentional with what we're going to include and what we're not going to include and why. And everything has to kind of have a reason. I mean, because, and I'll give you, it seems like an arbitrary one, but sometimes, especially when you get down to the copy editing of something, copy editors will just change a sentence. It's not they was looking out the window, they were looking out the window, right? And it seems like an easy, just a line edit, but that changes everything musically to me, and that's not pigeon, that's not what I'm. And so we had to kind of almost create a rule, like an etiquette rule of this, I meant that here. And there was one sentence that got taken out in various stages, that I'd sneak it back in, and it got taken out. And it was, Eddie would go. And it means nothing to most people, right? But to people in Hawaii, it means a whole lot.
It's
It,
the
it
surfer, right?
Eddie Aikau, and Eddie would go like, if you're kind of being put in the same grouping as like, oh, you're like, like that, it just means that you are going to rush into something. I mean, and I don't mean in a hasty way. I mean, you're going to face the unfaceable with courage and with honor, and for your people, you're going to do these really hard things, and so it means a lot. But I'm not going to explain all of that to you. And my argument for keeping it in, because people would say, well, if it doesn't mean anything, we can scratch it to the story. And I said, well, to the people that would know what that means, having it in there means a exponential amount more than not having it in there. I'd rather you not understand the reference than not have it in there at all, because it means so much to have these things that were a part of your world, the sayings and the mannerisms and certain kind of compliments and things like that, to see that reflected in literary form. I don't think I ever had, and it meant a lot to me when I'd have one, like when the movie The Descendants came out, the fact that the director made sure that whenever somebody walked in a door, they took their shoes off first. You can't believe what a big deal that felt like. Was, oh my god, they understood, they paid attention to that. So it's not a big deal to a mainstream watcher of this movie, because they're just watching and they're paying attention to the story. But to somebody from Hawaii, it's like, oh, okay, they know what they're talking about. It was another level of validation.
It's the Alexander Payne movie with George Clooney.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And I got to say, hearing you say all of this and talk about the process of leaving one editor in one house and moving to another always requires buy-in and a kind of shared understanding of the vision of the project for things to work out, especially so for a book like this, right? I mean,
Oh, and that, I mean, part of that was for me when I was, in order to defend all these things, I had to go back, right? I had to go talk to my kumu. I had to go back to the community leaders who were involved in those suits. I had to talk to the woman who wrote the apology bill. Like I had to make sure I was defending the right things for the right reasons, and it wasn't just artistic, me just saying, "No, I know more than you, and I'm going to push my weight." It was more of a like, okay, I got to get this right, and I'm going to ask you to trust me. But before I ask you to trust me, I got to go do my cultural homework and go home. So I went back many times to do that. And that was scary, and, but illuminating. And then, yeah, we did have to, it really kind of be very intentional, even just with the publishing of it. I went home first. I brought, before it was available publicly, I brought it home into Hilo, and it needed to be blessed in Keaukaha by the right people, and to have it start there and be offered to Keaukaha and to Hilo, because that's what ultimately what it is. It is my offering to my home. And so there wasn't any really kind of cultural rule book that I could follow for the protocol of how to launch a book like this, or not that I know of anyway. And so it was just kind of feeling my way in the dark and trying my hardest to remember all that I've been taught, and all of what I know of my home, and having this add to the efforts to make our home a a vibrant, viable place that is honored and respected and understood, not just by outsiders, but like by my children. What is my responsibility to my children, both of them, to perpetuate the stories of my family and our ways and our traditions? If I have an issue with all of that and decided to come to California and never talk about Hawaii ever again, which at a certain point in my life I wanted to do, that means the buck stops with me, right? The stories and the traditions and the things of my family. And so hula, and that's just, it's the same kind of idea, just on a much larger scale with a lot more at stake.
what do you mean by blessed? You take the book to Hilo and people, you have a ceremony? Like what?
We did have a little ceremony. We did. I mean, a long time ago when I was first started trying to write about Hawaii, I I it kept not working. Part of that was because I was still learning how to write, but somebody, probably my mom, said, well, maybe it's because you haven't asked permission. 'Cause she was always, when I was a kid, always defaulted to like, oh, your car died. Well, did you go and give your respects to Pele because you were driving past the crater? Or, oh, you're not feeling well. Oh, well, let's go up to the crater. Let's talk to Pele. Let's give her, some hokupu. And um like, how would we respect Pele in this situation, and how are we, acknowledging her presence during this, ceremony, or happening, anything like that. There was always that in the background. And so with this, have I didn't really know what that looks like. I asked an aunt of mine. She gave me some chants and some a certain protocol to follow. And then I brought some offerings for Pele, and I printed out a bunch of my writing, and I put it in a backpack, and I went down into the crater, and I kind of tried to create my own ceremony of offering my intentions, and myself, and then it just kind of went from there, every step of the way, of talking to community leaders. And so the person that ultimately did, I guess, quote unquote, the blessing, and it was more of a blessing for my intentions and the book, was, or is, somebody who stories are interwoven within this, who is very active in, the fight to keep Hawaii County and the state and all of the governing agencies accountable for what they're doing and their decisions that they continue to make, and that continue to affect all of the communities of Hawaii. And yeah, and all I could do was kind of hope that those things were, if they weren't enough, then at least people would know that I've been my intentions were there, that I've been trying every step to continue to make this not about me wanting to be an author. It was more about a book from Hawaii being offered up to the world as just a source of insight, hopefully, and my own kind of ike, my own knowledge.
So how has the book been received in Hilo?
In Hilo, I mean, and that it's been amazing because, a lot of people had, of course, it's a small town, so everybody heard about it, and speculated for a long time. And some people read early drafts, and they're like, "Oh, you are, no, not good," And so those criticisms and those things helped guide me too, because there were a lot of perspectives that I didn't have. But since the publication, it has actually been overwhelmingly amazing. I have people I grew up with reaching out and finding me and just saying, thank you for capturing my world. Thank you for capturing my experience here. And other people that have lived in Hawaii for generations and been part of it for, hundreds of years, but not Native Hawaiian, and saying thank you for kind of even just like the weirdness of what that experience is, for putting that on paper. And then I've had tourists and visitors, reach out and find me and say, just this put a whole different perspective and feeling and depth into our trip, or our what we deem our relationship with this place that we love to come on vacations or whatever. you know um as far as the other wider reception, I know some people, you know I think maybe would question my, I guess, me being the one to write this, you know and so all I can kind of do is have full disclosure, and maybe put that out more of who I am. I never meant to deceive anybody or anything about that. This was very much, to me, a Hi'i's story. But overall, so far it's been more than I could have hoped. People are talking about blood quantums, and people are talking about things that, yeah, for so long I've been talking about these subjects, and most people would just shake their head and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I've very much appreciated that all of a sudden people are like, oh, Hawaii is not just a destination. It's a place.
Right. Well, I got to say from personal experience that I have particular affection for the Big Island. I love the island of Hawaii. I love it. I had a great time there years ago. I think my wife and I were dating at that point. So we were young. I remember we extended our trip a few days. We had a great time. It's so beautiful, and it's such a varied landscape for a relatively small chunk of
Oh yeah,
land.
I mean, I'm partial to it, but I think of the what is it, 13 climate zones of the world, the island has 11, something
Yeah.
like that, you know. And I guess that was what I tried to also capture in the we is that what people that have never come to Hawaii don't realize is that Hawaii isn't beloved around the world because it's pretty. There are a lot of pretty places, you know, with warm waters and palm trees. It has an energy. The land itself has an energy. It's alive. And that has a voice too. And so that was part of what I tried to encompass with that we of like, no, you feel the water here. You're kind of on your toes, you know. You feel like, am I doing something? Should I be right there? There's a lot of different things at play on that island than just just a relaxing kind of trip golfing or something, you know.
Right. It's magical. It's beautiful. And, for the rest of us, for people who are not Native Hawaiian, for people who don't have deep family roots there and family history there, this question did occur to me. It's like, how is it best done to be a traveler visiting a place like Hawaii? Like, it gave me pause. Like, should I stay in a hotel? Is it better to do an Airbnb? Like, I'm not going to go to a luau, I'll tell you that, ever, unless it's like local, but no local's going to invite me to a luau, like unless I really get to know them. But
Unless you just
like
read hula, then yeah.
yeah, I'm just going to carry it around, be like,
Yeah.
please, can I, or just like, I want some auntie to kind of take me in and feed me. But,
Well, and that was part of, I have family in California that would say like, when are you going back to the islands? Because I want to go with you. And I'd say, go, all my family there. And they go, no, no, it's not the same. I want to go to your Hawaii, you know? And so that was part of why I wrote it the way I wrote it. But I would say for visitors, I'm not the tourist police. I have been to some places that I found very inspiring. There was a park that I happened upon in Palm Springs of all places. Palm Springs is just desert, and then all of a sudden there's like water, and it's like this, little oasis of all these different beautiful things and lush. And but when you drive into it, there's a big sign that says the tribe that this land belongs to and that they still govern over it, and the park rangers, who are very visible, are members of this tribe, and you pay money to contribute to the upkeep and the protection of these things. And even that, I mean, I would be sensitive to it anyway, coming from where I'm from, but reading that, and you have to stop at the gate and read that first. It's a simple 3 minutes of difference between just paying your parking and going into a park. It does change your experience. It makes you step lighter, and kind of take it in with a different kind of appreciation than just, oh, did I get that right selfie that I can, post on Instagram or whatever. And so I've seen things like that where I've seen it done. I've seen tourism done better in a slightly more sustainable way. And I know people now are proposing different things, emphasizing education in tourism, where people are, kind of made aware that they're stepping into a different culture. They're stepping into a different place. It's not simply in your backyard to play with, you know. And other than that, I mean, that was my only goal with this. It was more of a like, if I can just get you that slight paradigm shift of destination versus place, and which one are you seeing Hawaii as? It's a nuance, but I think it does make all the difference.
no, totally. And I think like it's complicated, I think, too, or at least it seems complicated from the perspective of Native Hawaiians and people who go back generations there, this relationship between tourism and wanting to maintain the integrity of their home, because the tourist economy is so vital. It's the lifeblood of Hawaii, right? Or at least one of the major
Well,
lifebloods.
that's what I mean. That's a big That's a whole other book. I do have a friend who wrote. She's from from the mainland, and she wrote a book of short essays about her relationship and her love, her lifelong love of Hawaii, but understanding that she would never be an insider, and what that looked like. So she dissected that, and in one of those stories, she tried to dig a little deeper, kind of go journalist on that well touted fact that tourism is Hawaii's bread and butter. It's our main economy. I know for myself that the only jobs that were available to locals most of the time were service. So you're getting paid minimum wage, if that. I made good money dancing, but that was very, very part time. And you can only do that for so long. Nobody wants to see me in my 40s dancing in a coconut bra, and sorry, but he, there isn't a lot of evidence except what the the hotel industry tells us of exactly how it benefits Hawaii. When a hotel is built in a town, it raises the cost of living in the surrounding area so much that most locals have to move. Because even if they got a job at said hotel, that the pay would not be commensurate with how much it would cost to live there. And so automatically you have something that upends it. And are they paying state taxes? Probably. Are they paying enough to trickle down in some way, shape, or form to actual Hawaiian communities? I haven't seen what that looks like, and she wasn't able to really go in depth. She got a lot of closed doors and a lot of unanswered, emails, I think. And was kind of left saying, I don't know, the jury's out as far as what exactly that means, that Hawaii tourism is the thing that keeps Hawaii alive. When tourism stopped, during COVID, during quarantine, everybody that I knew were very happy,
See, I thought about that. I thought about that. I was like,
Oh,
they must have loved it. They must have loved
oh,
it. They had the
corn
island.
grew back. There were birds that people thought were extinct that they saw, but also there were still jobs. They have uh, they have ag. They have an industry there that isn't all catered to serving your drinks.
See, this makes me. I mean, makes me not want to go. And I mean, not because I
Sorry.
don't want, not because I don't want to go, but because I just feel like they're like, Howleys, get out of here, basically. And I get it. Like, I don't want to be a part of the problem. Is the point? You
And
know.
I think it's become, I mean, the numbers are so staggering. So it's not necessarily that everybody in Hawaii wants every tourist to leave. It just, that's it. The blanket hard stop. I think a lot of it is a built up frustration of the numbers that continue to quadruple and just build on themselves. And a lot of people have spoiled it for the rest of the people that come respectfully and wanting to just appreciate and know more about the culture and more about the islands. You have some people that come very ignorant and very entitled and very disrespectful, not just to individuals but to the entire culture as a whole, and it's heartbreaking. And then it just makes everyone just say, okay, no, this is not acceptable, this is not okay. And part of it was the presentation that hula is not something, it's something to just be enjoyed, and our heiau and our museums and everything, they're just something that we can, they're kind of a novelty item to they're at our pleasure. And so I think it's not necessarily just this blanket you know disapproval. And I know that over time the emphasis and priority has changed to, let's educate people, and like that's how a culture and a language and everything continues to grow, right? That it is a living thing that builds upon itself. It's not something to be kept under glass in a museum. And Hawaii is not that. It's still a living, breathing, thing, and very much still to me a kingdom, that it's figuring out its way to survive, like a lot of cultures and a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. But I think there's a time and a place for tourism and tourists and people to appreciate and add something to it. I just don't think we figured out exactly what that looks like yet.
Well, the thing that I keep thinking of as I listen to you is that there would seem to be a market for like Hawaiian owned uh, hotels or resorts that like offer to people wanting to travel there an experience that honors all the things that you're talking about. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
this could be pie
Yeah.
in the sky, but like that's what I'm thinking. Like where's the place to go stay where like you get to learn and people sort of teach you a little bit about the history and you get to immerse yourself in it in a way that goes beyond mere consumption.
And I guess that because of the price of land there, even just that simple thought of those hotels, that land was stolen. Most of those hotels were built through, very shifty, not so transparent ways of doing that. And now it's so insurmountable to try to even conceive of that. I know that the emphasis has been buy local. Don't just go to Walmart and get that thing from, the Philippines or wherever it's from. Like, shop local if you're going to come here. At the very least, do that homework, right? And I know that the tourism authority has been contemplating how to more integrate, um, listing places where you can go and have cultural experiences, and participate in certain things with local nonprofits and different organizations and education groups and so forth, to make your experience one that also helps Hawaii.
Mm.
Go work in the field a little bit, go work in the lo'i or something, but as far as it, like, even just saying, oh well, locals should have this hotel and we should support that. Well, those commercial places, the odds now of playing into that game are so skewed against locals that it goes all the way back to who owns the land and who has a right to say where it goes. The government still, and by the government I mean America, the state and federal, still decide, even with quote unquote Hawaiian homelands, they still decide if they're going to lease it to Walmart, or or if they're going to turn it into a development for Hawaiians. And we see that now with the TMT. I'm not sure, the fight over the Mauna on the Big Island as well. And the only reason that's not a thing right now is because when COVID happened, the protest camps and everything kind of had to
Wait,
disband.
what is
But
this?
there was so the Big Island also happens to be one of the best places to study stars, right? We have a very good, a low, I think, light pollution, and then also we have Mauna Kea, which is one of the best in the world to have your telescope. Problem is, we have multiple telescopes, and they've been detrimental to the environment there. And there's so many different things about what's wrong with all that is already there. But a proposed telescope, very well funded, which is larger than all of the other telescopes combined. It's 30 meters. They have the spot picked out, and it's basically the most culturally sensitive spot, and it's virgin ground. And the minute you doze on it and build in it, we can never recover that, and it's absolutely sacred. And so the state, of course, gave a go ahead. The university system there said, well, we have a lease for this land that was given to us by, I don't know, the military or whatever. So we're going to do this project. And the telescope development was kind of given the green light, but it's a lot of big equipment, right? And so they were trying to bring trucks and to go up to the Mauna. And the one thing that people could do, there was a rally cry, and everybody blocked the road and lived there. And it turned into this amazingly beautiful thing. This was 2019, I believe. I mean, it was just a beautiful, it was people coming from all over the world to appreciate it, and they were giving classes and dancing hula every day. And I mean, and the elements up there are fierce. There's snow, it's high elevation, you get sick. So them living up there just was no easy feat. And sadly, the governor sent police, sent people to kind of tear everything apart, all down. And we're still fighting it. People are still fighting it, and people are still kind of watching the road to make sure that they're not going to pull it's easier to say sorry than for ask for permission, ask for forgiveness, not permission, type of thing. But so all these things are happening in real time, and it all goes back to, it all kind of sometimes leads you back to the land. And that's why it had to, that's why hula had to include all of that, because it does originate from the coup, from these racist acts, from the 20s, and it has continued, it is perpetuated. And history, you said earlier that the structure of it was not easy. It wasn't. And it's cyclical, and part of that was to show the repetitiveness, sadly, of certain things, that when you don't analyze it, or whether you don't know what's going on, it just perpetuates. And that was, to me, the scariest thing when I was doing my research. All the players that I was writing about, like, they're corrupt and they're doing these nefarious things, they're still there. And those things are still happening, and the structure is almost identical to what it was, because the fox is, kind of guarding the hen house.
Well, I will recommend to anyone who is about to go on their honeymoon in Hawaii to read your novel. Anybody who's planning to travel there would be well served to read hula, because, as somebody who has been more than once to the islands, it definitely changed my perspective for the better and made it completely new. I'll never see it the same after reading this book, and that's to your credit.
Thank
And
you.
I commend you for enduring all that you had to endure to get this book into the world. And I always ask people, this is the cruel question at the end, if they're working on anything else.
Yeah.
Is there another book? I mean, this feels like such an undertaking and such a life's work, but there might be more, or is there something else cooking?
Well, the funny thing was, I was writing for about a decade, so this is the overnight success that happened, over the course of a decade. Um, I've done so much research on different things, different parts of history, that I don't want to box myself in as like a historical fiction writer, because I'm not a historian. But I just find there's certain parts of things that have happened that aren't talked about, and the blanks aren't filled in. And so, to connect certain dots, I'm going to be vague because I don't know exactly where this book is going. But to answer, yes, I have a lot of research that right now feels like a lot of different puzzle pieces, that my charge is to kind of put them together and see what the bigger picture is. And so I work back, and that was kind of how I saw hula, where I didn't know what the ending was going to be. I didn't know exactly what this book was going to cover. There were just a lot of puzzle pieces that I was just trying to piece one piece with the next one and the next one, and go from there. And so, sadly, I would like a break, but I think it's happening all over again. So there we go. I'm just going to let it go and
I'm so
continue
sorry.
to ride with it.
I'm so sorry. But it will be a narrative that has to do with Hawaii.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I am grateful to you for your time. Thank you for taking, an hour and change to talk with me about your book.
Thank you.
Congratulations and
Thank
best
you
of
so
luck
much.
on the next one.
Thank you so much.